In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women operated what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. The majority never made it back home. Those who did came back changed. The Maine State Archives contain testimony from one survivor that was so disturbing, authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we continue with the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest chapters of American history. If you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying, the calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. In the late 18th century, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a wilderness territory where isolated communities struggled to survive harsh winters and even harsher realities. Millbridge, a small coastal town of just 300 people, served as a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen who were brave enough to brave the Atlantic's perilous waters. A piece of land that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors lay 15 miles inland, through thick forest only marked by Native American hunting trails. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a gray October morning in 1798. Their horse-drawn wagon loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies that drew curious glances from townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down from the wagon with the bearing of European nobility, a striking woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her voice carried the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to command and absolute obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next, a tall, gaunt woman of 30 with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the precise grace of a master craftsman. Her fingers were long and pale, with an unusual steadiness that would later prove essential to her gruesome work. Unlike her superior, Prudence spoke little, observing the world through pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. When she did speak, her voice held traces of a Scottish accent, cultured but with an underlying coldness that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. Temperance Ashford, the novice, who was the youngest of the 3, appeared to be barely past the age of 22. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate attention, raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. But there was something unsettling about her beauty, a quality that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer when she passed. She had an unsettling habit of studying people as if they were specimens in a collection, and her smile never reached her eyes. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking to establish a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents that would later be revealed as masterful forgeries. Their story was compelling enough to satisfy the Protestant community of Millbridge, who viewed the presence of educated religious women as a civilizing influence on their rough frontier settlement. With gold coins that seemed inexhaustible, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow who had struggled to pay her late husband's debts. The price they paid, 3 times the land's assessed value, raised eyebrows, but also ensured enthusiastic cooperation from local authorities. They immediately hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to construct their religious retreat. The building that rose from the wilderness over the following 8 months was unlike any religious structure the workers had ever seen. 3 stories of gray stone quarried from the nearby coast, with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within. The windows were unusually small and positioned high on the walls, making it impossible to see inside from ground level. Most peculiar was the basement level, which required extensive excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond what would be needed for simple storage. When questioned about the unusual architecture, Mother Superior Agatha explained with a serene smile that penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is completely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most listeners, though some of the older workers privately wondered why a house of God needed to look so much like a fortress. The Ashford women paid close attention to every aspect of the construction process. They insisted on a few modifications that the builders thought were odd: heavy-duty reinforced doors, drainage systems that could handle a lot of liquid, and ventilation shafts that looked more like they belonged in a hospital than a convent. When workers asked about these features, the sisters cited their experience with similar religious institutions in Europe, claiming these were standard accommodations for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. One of the sisters' earliest and most ardent supporters was the circuit physician Samuel Hartwell, who worked between frontier settlements. A man in his 50s with a reputation for progressive medical thinking, Dr. Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of feminine psychology and mental disorders. He was amazed at their sophisticated understanding of conditions that the majority of doctors barely recognized during their first meeting. They, sisters, possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia. He wrote in his journal, "Their methods, while unconventional, are based on sound medical principles that I fear are decades ahead of current American practice. They speak of techniques for addressing the root causes of mental disturbance rather than merely treating symptoms." What Dr. Hartwell didn't record in his official journal was the private conversation he had with Mother Superior Agatha about the financial arrangements for their collaboration. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing medical supplies through his connections, Dr. Hartwell would receive a substantial monthly payment and access to detailed case studies that could advance his own medical career. For a physician struggling to make a living on the frontier, it was an offer too valuable to refuse. The convent's reputation spread throughout the territory with remarkable speed. Families from settlements as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston began hearing whispered recommendations about the Ashford sisters' miraculous ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost was steep. $20 for a month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they called complete reformation. But it seemed like a small price to pay for peace and respectability for desperate families that had to deal with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives. The types of women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to reveal their lovers' identities arrived alongside wives who had publicly challenged their husbands' authority. Daughters who didn't want to be in an arranged marriage were sent to the same place as women who had too much interest in politics or books. The common thread was defiance, women who had somehow stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. The convent's patrons were also influenced by the time's religious strife. Puritan families occasionally sent daughters who had shown interest in Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglican families disposed of daughters attracted to the emotional fervor of Baptist revival meetings. The Ashford sisters accepted all denominations with equal enthusiasm, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803, when young Thomas Brewster was hunting in the forest surrounding the mysterious institution. Unusual noises drew the 20-year-old trapper's attention to the stone structure that stood out against the gloomy winter sky after he had spent hours tracing a wounded deer through the snow-covered wilderness. Despite the fact that Thomas had spent his entire life in these woods, he was familiar with every natural sound, including the distant howl of wolves, the crackle of ice-laden branches, and the wind whispering through pine needles. However, what Thomas heard that night was distinct, completely wrong, and unmistakably human. Through the snow-heavy air came screaming that rose and fell in waves, sometimes dying to desperate whimpers before exploding again into raw, primal shrieks of agony that made his blood freeze in his veins. As the terrible noises persisted, Thomas drew closer to the convent, abandoning his wounded prey. From the outside, the building appeared completely dark, but as he circled around to the rear, he saw a faint glow coming from basement windows that were partially obscured by snow drifts. As he got closer, the screams got louder, as did other sounds like the clang of metal instruments, urgent whispers, and something that sounded like sawing. Thomas saw a scene that would stay with him for the rest of his life through a basement window that was partially obscured. The basement had been turned into what could only be described as a surgical theater for the rest of his life. Dozens of oil lamps and candles shone brightly on the stone walls, casting ethereal shadows. A woman was secured to a wooden table with leather restraints, her head held immobile by a metal apparatus that looked more like a torture device than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her usually pale face flushed with concentration, as she manipulated what appeared to be a long, thin metal rod. A portion of the patient's head had been shaved, revealing a pale scalp with ink-drawn dark lines. Most horrifying of all, there was clearly an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas was horrified to realize that the darker substance beneath the gleam of exposed bone was brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain, but what made the scene even more nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as if she were documenting a routine medical procedure. Sister Prudence was handed additional instruments by Novice Temperance, who did so with the skill of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off as the patient lost consciousness. Despite the fact that their patient was no longer responding to their instructions, the sisters continued their work with methodical precision. Unable to witness anymore, Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. The image of that basement chamber burned itself into his memory. The casual efficiency of the procedures, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the realization that this was clearly not the first time such horrors had occurred within those stone walls. When Thomas reached town the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery with such frantic intensity that his father feared the boy had suffered a mental breakdown. As his son described scenes that appeared to belong in Gothic novels rather than a respectable religious institution, the elder Brewster, a practical man who valued community stability above all else, listened with increasing alarm. His father, Thomas, carefully remarked, "You were hunting alone in the dark in a blizzard after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some kind." The sisters are known to treat various feminine ailments that require intimate intervention. But Thomas's description was too detailed, too specific to be dismissed as hallucination or misunderstanding. He was able to convincingly describe the layout of the basement chamber, the instruments he had seen, and the clinical manner in which the procedures were being carried out. This wasn't the random violence of madness, but something far more sinister, systematic, methodical, and clearly practiced. Deacon Morrison, the town's most revered citizen and unofficial moral authority, was the elder Brewster's choice. Morrison was a cautious man who had built his reputation on careful judgment and community harmony. The Ashford sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and maintaining perfect decorum in their rare public appearances. Moreover, several prominent families' daughters and wives were currently receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this nature could destroy reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not common criminals. There must be a reasonable explanation for what the boy thinks he saw." However, the deacon was too responsible to ignore such serious allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, visiting the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor, a sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch visitors with judgmental eyes. As she served tea and inquired about the health of his family with apparent genuine concern, her demeanor was flawlessly gracious and composed. She did not exhibit any signs of anxiety or guilt. When Deacon Morrison delicately mentioned that local hunters had reported unusual noises coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha's expression showed only mild concern and understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her cultured English accent, "we often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of night. The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many of their patients were in severe spiritual distress when they came in, possessed by pride, lust, and rebellion demons that were trying desperately to stop the purifying power of Christian discipline. "Some women," she continued with sympathetic sadness, "have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the process of extraction requires considerable effort. The sounds your hunters heard were likely the cries of demons being cast out through the power of prayer and penance." The explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The concept of spiritual warfare was familiar to all frontier Christians, and the idea that particularly corrupted souls might require extreme measures for their salvation was not unreasonable within the religious context of the era. Mother Superior Agatha then offered to show him through the upper levels of the convent, leading him through Spartan but clean dormitory rooms where several women sat in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison noticed they seemed unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. When he attempted to make eye contact with them, they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if their attention was focused on something invisible in the distance. When the deacon asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained that they served as the convent's intensive spiritual counseling facilities for women requiring the most focused attention. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she said with a modest smile. "Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption require private examination of the soul that would compromise the patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation seemed reasonable within the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had indeed misinterpreted what he had witnessed. However, something continued to trouble him during the ride home, a subtle wrongness that he couldn't quite identify, but couldn't shake from his thoughts. The women he had observed seemed too quiet, too controlled, moving with an unnatural uniformity that reminded him more of sleepwalkers than conscious human beings, and there had been a smell throughout the building that he couldn't quite place, not just the expected odors of medicine and cleaning solutions, but something else underneath. Something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering had been so thick it seemed to coat the inside of his throat. Following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters implemented additional security measures that made their operations even more secretive. The loud screaming that had alerted Thomas Brewster was replaced by an eerie silence that somehow seemed more ominous than the previous nocturnal disturbances. Local families continued sending their troubled women to the convent, and the sisters continued accepting them with open arms and increasingly sophisticated promises of transformation. However, observant residents began noticing disturbing patterns that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the treatments being administered. Behind those stone walls, women who entered the convent for spiritual correction often emerged months later as completely different people, not reformed or redeemed, but somehow fundamentally altered in ways that defied explanation. Mary Prescott had been a young woman of 19, known throughout Millbridge for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence that had scandalized her family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable young men. Her parents had finally sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare her for a proper marriage after being embarrassed by her public displays of willfulness. When Mary returned home, her parents were initially delighted by the transformation. Gone was the rebellious daughter who had argued about everything from household duties to religious doctrine. In her place was a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when directly addressed and never expressed personal opinions or desires. She accepted the first marriage proposal that came her way with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or preference about the match. But as weeks passed, Mary's parents grew increasingly concerned about their daughter's condition. She displayed no recognition of favorite foods, cherished possessions, or childhood friends. When shown letters she had written before her treatment, she stared at them without comprehension, as if looking at documents written by a complete stranger. Worst of all, she did not appear to be aware of either happiness or sorrow, pleasure or pain, and she did not express any emotion. Dr. Hartwell, when consulted about Mary's condition, praised the sisters' work as a complete success. The patient has been cured of the mental defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood, he declared confidently. The rebellious spirit that caused her family such distress has been completely eliminated through proper spiritual discipline. However, Mary's mother noticed details that troubled her deeply. Her daughter bore unusual scars on her scalp, partially hidden by her hair but visible during washing and brushing. The scars formed a pattern that suggested some kind of deliberate procedure rather than accidental injury. When questioned about them, Mary showed no memory of how they had been acquired, stating simply that she remembered nothing about her time at the convent except praying very hard to become a better woman. Similar transformations occurred with increasing frequency as the convent's reputation spread throughout New England. Hannah Morse, sent for treatment of melancholia following the death of her infant son, returned home after 3 months as an unnaturally cheerful woman who claimed to have no memory of ever having a child. She did not show any emotion or recognition when she was shown the baby's clothes and toys, as if that entire period of her life had been wiped out of her memory. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most disturbing. After publicly accusing her husband of adultery and requesting a divorce, the merchant's wife had been committed to the convent for hysteria, scandalous behavior that threatened the social standing of both families. When she returned after 4 months of treatment, she not only retracted her accusations but insisted she had never made them. Even more troubling was the fact that she appeared to have no recollection of the circumstances that led to her engagement, describing her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband as untouchable. The physical state of Elizabeth was also troubling. Family members noticed that she frequently appeared confused about basic information, forgot the names of longtime friends, became lost in familiar neighborhoods, and struggled with simple tasks that had once been second nature to her. She also complained of severe headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time. Like the other reformed women, she bore mysterious scars on her scalp and claimed no memory of how they had been acquired. Dr. Hartwell continued his enthusiastic endorsement of the Ashford methods, though his own behavior grew increasingly erratic as the years passed. The once respected physician began drinking heavily and often spoke in rambling monologues about advancing medical science and necessary sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. His journal entries from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a man wrestling with his conscience while justifying increasingly horrific actions. The procedures I have witnessed challenge every principle of medical ethics I was taught, yet the results are undeniable. The sisters have achieved what European physicians only theorize about, the ability to alter personality, suppress specific memories, and modify behavior through direct surgical intervention in the brain. Their documentation is meticulous, their methodology sound, their results consistent and reproducible. History will decide whether we are monsters who exploit human suffering or pioneers who advance human knowledge. The flow of correspondence between the convent and various European medical institutions intensified dramatically during this period. Local postal workers, though sworn to confidentiality through generous payments, couldn't help but notice the volume of packages and letters bearing foreign addresses. The Ashford sisters were receiving regular shipments of medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds, while sending out detailed reports and what appeared to be preserved biological specimens. Mother Superior Agatha began making monthly trips to Portland and Boston, always returning with crates of supplies and equipment that required careful handling. She explained to curious locals that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders, combining traditional spiritual healing with the latest advances in European medical science. Her cultured manner and obvious education made these explanations seem plausible to a community that valued both religious faith and scientific progress. But some residents remained deeply suspicious of the changes they observed in the convent's patients. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had undergone treatment and returned fundamentally altered, began quietly questioning other families about their experiences. She discovered a disturbing pattern. None of the women who had received intensive treatment in the basement facilities could remember anything about their time at the convent except fragments of prayers and religious instruction. Martha's investigation revealed another troubling fact. Several women had simply never returned from the convent at all. When families inquired about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford sisters claimed these women had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to remain as permanent residents, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. However, families who requested to visit these supposed residents were politely but firmly turned away, told that the women had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion that prohibited any contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened when Martha learned that the convent was accepting women from increasingly distant locations. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston were sending their troubled daughters to the faraway Maine school, apparently willing to pay a lot of money and travel a long way in exchange for the promise of complete behavioral change. The fees had risen accordingly. The sisters now charged up to $500 for what they termed comprehensive reformation, a process that typically required 6 months and guaranteed permanent elimination of all undesirable traits and tendencies. The Ashford sisters had established themselves as recognized authorities on female mental disorders within the medical communities of both Europe and the United States as the convent entered its second decade of operation. Martha Goodwin's initial suspicions about her daughter Rebecca's altered state after treatment at the convent were just the tip of the iceberg. Her quiet inquiries soon revealed a chilling pattern. Women who received intensive treatment in the basement facilities had no memory of their time there, only fragments of prayers. Even more disturbing, many women never left, with the Ashford sisters claiming they had chosen a life of seclusion and prayer. Families who tried to visit these permanent residents were always turned away. As the convent's reputation grew, so did its reach. Wealthy families from distant cities like New York and Charleston paid exorbitant fees, up to $500 for a 6-month, comprehensive reformation that promised permanent elimination of undesirable traits. The Ashford sisters, having established themselves as authorities on female mental disorders, corresponded with prominent physicians across Europe and the United States. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, a dedicated correspondent for 15 years, praised their sophistication of their research and their understanding of behavioral modification. A sinister science uncovered. What Dr. Whitmore didn't realize was that he was reading clinical descriptions of procedures that would later be recognized as primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford sisters had developed a profound understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects. They meticulously documented each patient's personality before treatment, every aspect of their experimental procedures, and post-treatment changes in memory, personality, and cognitive function. Sister Prudence became an expert in targeted cranial intervention, developing methods for accessing specific brain regions. Her detailed anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, showcased her advanced understanding. These procedures were conducted with clinical detachment. Patients were sedated with opiates, but kept conscious enough for the sisters to monitor real-time effects by asking questions and observing behavioral changes as they manipulated brain regions. Novice Temperance, the convent's expert in psychological conditioning, developed elaborate protocols to reinforce surgical effects. Her methods included controlled nutrition, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, and social isolation, all designed to dismantle existing personalities and rebuild them according to specific desires. They also pioneered the use of chemical compounds obtained through their medical contacts, experimenting with different drug combinations to enhance their results. By 1815, over 400 women had been processed. While their definition of success was the complete elimination of undesirable traits, their records showed success rates exceeding 90%. Women who died during treatment were recorded as failures and their bodies preserved for further study. The sisters also began accepting research volunteers, destitute women, often prostitutes or vagrants, who provided test subjects for their most experimental procedures in exchange for food and shelter. The documentation from these experiments, later found in hidden archives, revealed a systematic and horrifying approach to human experimentation. The sisters recorded precise skull measurements, brain tissue reactions, and the relationship between surgical interventions and behavioral changes. They also engaged in a thriving black market, selling their findings to medical institutions throughout Europe and America who were unable or unwilling to conduct such studies ethically. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna was one of their most lucrative customers, paying substantial sums for documentation on eliminating specific memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating compliant behavioral states. Even the University of Edinburgh unknowingly incorporated the Ashford findings into its medical school curriculum. Perhaps most chillingly, the sisters began accepting commissions for specific types of behavior modification. Wealthy families could request the elimination of artistic interests, reduction of intellectual curiosity, suppression of romantic attachments, or the creation of perfect domestic compliance, with specialized procedures and premium prices for each. Sarah Whitman's courageous exposure. The sisters' carefully constructed facade began to crack in the winter of 1818 with the arrival of Sarah Whitman. Unlike other broken women, Sarah was a fighter. At 24, with an unusually comprehensive education, including exposure to medical texts, she recognized the true nature of the convent. She had been committed for giving birth out of wedlock and refusing to reveal the father's identity. From the moment she arrived, Sarah observed the other residents' mechanically altered personalities, vacant eyes, and visible scalp scars. Her medical knowledge allowed her to identify these as signs of deliberate brain damage. Subjected to the same preliminary examinations, skull measurements, personality questioning, and neurological tests, Sarah resisted the standard conditioning procedures. Despite isolation, food and water deprivation, and psychological abuse, she remained defiant. Sister Temperance's attempts to break her will through sensory deprivation, extreme temperatures, and sleep disruption failed. During a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, flooding in the basement disrupted the convent's operations, creating the chaos Sarah needed. She slipped away from her guards and explored the restricted basement chambers. There, she found operating tables with restraints, surgical instruments unlike anything in conventional medicine, and glass jars containing preserved human brain tissue, meticulously labeled with patient names and procedural notes. The surgical records documented deliberate brain damage, with detailed sketches of open skulls and anatomical diagrams. Most damning were the extensive correspondence files, letters from European physicians purchasing the sisters' research data with casual indifference. Realizing the convent was a business selling the results of human experimentation, Sarah frantically planned her escape. She knew she was scheduled for intensive treatment and would likely be permanently damaged. On a moonless night in early April 1819, she overpowered a guard and fled into the forest. For 3 harrowing days, she evaded the sisters' relentless pursuit, surviving on spring water and wild plants. Justice, or a vanishing act. On the 3rd day, deteriorating physically, Sarah encountered a trapper named Joshua Meadows. Initially suspicious, he was convinced by her detailed knowledge of the convent and her desperate story. Joshua provided her with food, clothing, and safe passage to Sheriff William Hawthorne's office in Millbridge. Sheriff Hawthorne, initially skeptical, was swayed by Sarah's precise knowledge of the convent's interior and, more importantly, the crucial documents she had stolen. A surgical log covering procedures on 23 women over 8 months, detailing brain damage inflicted to alter personality and behavior. One chilling entry described Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old committed for excessive reading, whose brain regions associated with learning were damaged to reduce her compulsive interest in books and her ability to engage in complex reasoning. The successful outcome: patient now displays appropriate feminine docility and shows no interest in activities beyond basic household tasks. A detailed correspondence file with Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of cranial intervention research data for 4,000 Austrian florins. This revealed an international network of researchers in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris receiving regular reports from the Ashford sisters, who acted as commercial suppliers of information that legitimate researchers couldn't obtain through ethical means. A patient catalogue listing over 600 women since 1798. Most were reformed and returned, some permanent residents, but nearly 200 were simply marked expired. Women who had died during or shortly after experimental procedures. Confronted with this overwhelming evidence, Sheriff Hawthorne immediately organized a raid on the convent, assembling 15 armed men and sending urgent messages to federal authorities. However, the Ashford sisters, alerted by their network of informants, had vanished by the time the raiding party arrived on May 20, 1819. They took most of their portable equipment and documentation, leaving behind only the undeniable evidence in the basement, a fully equipped surgical theater with instruments designed for cranial procedures. The search revealed that the 3 women had fled Europe in 1797, establishing their false identity as Anglican nuns to continue their horrific research free from oversight. The Ashford sisters' reign of terror ended not with their capture, but with their disappearance. The horrors they inflicted, meticulously documented and scientifically precise, stand as a chilling testament to the darkest side of unchecked ambition and scientific hubris. What do you think happened to the Ashford sisters after their escape, and how do you believe their research might have impacted the course of early medical understanding, even if indirectly? This story is truly chilling. It's about the Ashford sisters, who spent over 20 years doing awful human experiments, learning things no normal scientist could. When they escaped, it started a huge search across America and even into Europe. But the sisters totally vanished. All that was left was the horrifying proof of their 2 decades of experiments. The investigation showed they had many ways to escape the convent and had gotten very rich from their illegal acts. Bank records revealed they'd sent huge amounts of money, over $50,000, which would be millions today, to Canada, Mexico, and Europe. They had also created fake identities and safe houses, showing they'd planned their escape from the very beginning. Shipping records indicated they'd been slowly moving their equipment and papers out of the convent for months before Sarah, a survivor, escaped. They were ready for their evil deeds to be found out. The investigation uncovered the full horror of what they did. For 21 years, the Ashford sisters experimented on over 600 women. About 250 were sent home, supposedly cured, but they all had brain damage from surgery. Another 150 women were said to have stayed at the convent permanently, but no trace of them was ever found. The sisters had apparently murdered these patients if they weren't suitable to return to society, keeping their bodies for study and getting rid of them when they were no longer useful. The remaining 200 women were found in different states in the convent's hidden rooms. These were likely patients who died during experiments or were killed on purpose because their reactions gave valuable research data. They kept these bodies to study them over long periods. The investigation also found a large group of helpers in the medical and university fields. Dr. Hartwell was just one of many doctors who sent patients to the convent and gave medical supplies for access to the experiment results. Male workers, suppliers, and even local officials were paid to keep the convent's activities secret. Universities in America and Europe unknowingly used the Ashford sisters' research in their medical lessons. Surgery methods and mind theories taught to new doctors were based on these horrible human experiments done in the Maine wilderness. This discovery forced everyone to painfully rethink where medical knowledge came from and if doctors were doing the right thing. The victims' families had a terrible choice: seek justice or protect their family's good name. Publicly admitting their loved ones were horribly experimented on would cause a scandal and ruin their standing in the community. Most chose to stay quiet, dealing with their private sadness instead of public shame. This silence meant the full extent of the Ashford sisters' crimes was never officially recognized. The investigation quietly ended after 6 months, with most of the evidence hidden in government files that wouldn't be opened for over 100 years. The official story simply said 3 women running a fake medical place had run away from the law, leaving behind proof of unusual treatments. Local people eventually burned the convent down to remove all traces of what happened there. However, the sisters' detailed experiment records were saved and eventually made their way to medical places around the world. It's ironic, but research gained through such terrible means actually helped us understand the brain and mental problems better. Sarah Whitman, the only survivor to escape and tell the truth, suffered for years from her experience. She spent months telling her story to investigators and helping find other victims, but it was emotionally crushing. Knowing she was the only one willing to speak publicly about the horrors she saw made her feel alone in a society that preferred to forget such uncomfortable truths. Sarah eventually moved to California, using a different name, where she worked as a teacher and tried to rebuild her life. She never married and had little contact with her family, who were embarrassed by her public testimony about the convent. Her detailed book, written just before she died in 1863, gave the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears and was vital proof of the sisters' crimes. The Ashford sisters themselves were never caught. There were unconfirmed sightings of them in different places in the Americas and Europe over the next few decades. Some investigators thought they kept working under new names, while others believed they were killed by people who wanted to get rid of witnesses to their crimes. A report from Argentina in 1847 described 3 old women running a private medical place for rich families, but the investigation wasn't clear. The most believable story came from a French doctor who claimed to have met Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856. He said she was working under a fake name as a private doctor for women's nerve problems, using methods very similar to those at the Maine convent. But when authorities looked into it, the woman had already disappeared, leaving only small clues about who she really was. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears is one of the most organized and longest examples of human experimentation in American history. The Ashford sisters mixed scientific methods with no morals at all, creating a research program that helped medical knowledge but destroyed hundreds of lives. Their careful records showed techniques and ideas that wouldn't be officially recognized by normal medicine for decades, but at a human cost that's too awful to imagine. The case also showed how vulnerable women were in early American society, where social pressures and legal limits allowed 3 criminals to operate freely for over 20 years. The organized use of society's most vulnerable people, excused by claims of medical progress and social good, shows how easily good intentions can hide terrible crimes. Perhaps most disturbing, the silence after the sisters were exposed showed society's willingness to hide uncomfortable truths instead of facing the impact of organized abuse. The families, medical groups, and government officials who chose secrecy over justice made sure the victims' suffering would be forgotten and that similar crimes might happen again. This mystery shows us the terrifying danger of uncontrolled scientific ambition combined with prejudice against vulnerable people. The fact that 3 women could run a program of human experiments for over 2 decades, with the quiet support of doctors and community leaders, shows how dangerous knowledge can become when it's pursued without morals or ethical oversight. What do you think of this story? Could such systematic horrors really have stayed hidden for so long in early American society? The evidence suggests that seeking knowledge, when separated from human kindness and responsibility, can lead to terrible acts that challenge what we think of as civilized behavior. Do you believe that similar crimes could happen today, hidden behind respectable appearances and scientific progress? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on this chilling part of American history. If you liked this story and want more dark mysteries like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves finding the hidden secrets of our past. The shadows of history hold many more truths that powerful people try to erase forever. See you in the next video, where we'll reveal another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about American history.